I didn't know my life was about to split in half the moment I checked my watch for the 5th time that night. I remember thinking, just 20 more minutes. 20 more minutes and I'd walk into my husband's birthday party with an apology ready, a smile rehearsed, and the vintage Cartier necklace I'd commissioned months ago resting in its velvet box. The kind of gift meant to erase inconvenience, smooth tension, and remind him that everything we had was built together. I was wrong. I had built quantum dynamics from nothing, coded the first machine learning models in my college dorm, secured the patents, fought for funding, survived years of 18-hour days. I owned 91% of the company. But my husband, Jason, had become the face of it. Charismatic, polished, magnetic to investors and cameras. I stayed behind the scenes. I always had. That night, a crucial Series C meeting with Tokyo investors ran long. $75 million was on the table, money that could triple our valuation overnight. I told myself Jason would understand. He always said he did. When I finally pulled up to the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 10:20 p.m., something felt off. People were leaving, laughing, glowing, euphoric. The party was already over. I stepped out of my car, clutching the small black box in my hand, my stomach tightening as if my body already knew what my mind refused to accept. Jason's parties never ended early. His world thrived on excess, champagne, live music, curated glamour that I paid for without question. Then I saw Miranda Blackwell, one of his society friends, drifting past me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "look who finally decided to show up." The laughter around her wasn't kind. My chest dropped. I pushed through the revolving doors, and that's when I saw him. Jason, standing beneath the crystal chandeliers, holding hands with Brianna Stone, his marketing director. Too close, too familiar. Her fingers laced through his like they belonged there. And when Jason saw me, he didn't flinch. He smirked. "Oh," he said lightly, tilting his head. "You came. I thought you got my message. You weren't invited tonight." In that moment, surrounded by marble floors and money I had earned, something inside me went terrifyingly still. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was the beginning of the end. I'm Emily Anderson. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, my identity was inseparable from the company I built, Quantum Dynamics. I wasn't born into money. I didn't marry into it either. I earned it. I started coding before it was fashionable, back when machine learning was something professors argued about in lecture halls, instead of something investors bragged about on podcasts. I wrote my first neural network in a cramped college dorm room, powered by instant ramen and stubborn belief. While others partied, I debugged. While classmates chased prestige jobs, I chased an idea that refused to let me sleep. Quantum dynamics wasn't an accident. It was obsession, sacrifice, and relentless focus. I met Jason 3 years into that journey. He was charming in a way that felt effortless. Tall, well-spoken, always seemed to know exactly what to say in a room full of strangers. He didn't understand the math behind my work, but he understood people. Investors leaned toward him. Journalists remembered him. He had that rare ability to make others feel important just by listening. At first, that felt like balance. I handled algorithms, infrastructure, patents, and long-term strategy. Jason handled pitch decks, public speaking, and social presence. He loved the spotlight. I loved disappearing into problems no one else could solve. When quantum dynamics began gaining traction, the attention exploded faster than either of us expected. Media profiles, conference invitations, panels, interviews. Somewhere along the way, Jason stopped saying, "My wife built this." He started saying, "We founded this." I told myself it didn't matter. I owned 91% of the company. The documents were airtight. Recognition was noise. Substance was what counted. And he was my husband. We'd been married 8 years by the time everything fell apart. 8 years of shared routines, late-night takeout, celebratory champagne after funding rounds. 8 years where I quietly financed a lifestyle that expanded faster than our emotional intimacy. Jason liked beautiful things. I liked giving them to him, at first. A monthly allowance that started reasonable and ballooned into $38,000 without a single conversation. Designer wardrobes shipped from Paris and Milan. First-class flights everywhere. Private trainers, luxury spas. Hotels that charged more per night than most people's rent. Whenever I hesitated, he'd smile and say, "This is part of the image, Em. It helps the brand." And I believed him. His family adored him and tolerated me. They never said it outright, but it was always there. The subtle tension, the unspoken resentment that I was the one with control. His mother would joke about how men should be providers. His father would ask Jason questions about the company while barely acknowledging me, even though I funded every single thing they admired. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. Jason stopped asking my opinion. He stopped inviting me to meetings. He stopped correcting journalists when they referred to him as the founder. And when I brought it up, carefully, gently, he'd laugh and kiss my forehead. "Why are you so sensitive? Everyone knows you're smart. This doesn't change anything between us." I wanted to believe that. So I ignored the growing distance. I ignored the way his assistant flinched around me. I ignored how often Brianna Stone appeared in his orbit, always professional, always present, always a little too familiar. I told myself trust meant not keeping score. I didn't realize I was slowly being written out of my own life. And by the time I arrived late to that party, the story Jason had been telling everyone was already complete, without me in it. The truth is, betrayal rarely begins with a single dramatic moment. It begins quietly, soft enough that you convince yourself you're imagining things. After Jason became more visible in the company, small shifts started to happen. Meetings I used to attend suddenly didn't need my presence anymore. Investor dinners were scheduled last minute, always framed as purely social. When I asked questions, Jason would reassure me with that same practiced calm. "You hate those things anyway, Em. Loud rooms, shallow conversations. I'm doing you a favor." Maybe once that was true, but it stopped feeling like consideration and started feeling like exclusion. Brianna Stone became impossible to miss. She was smart, articulate, and knew exactly how to present herself. Confident without seeming threatening, ambitious without appearing desperate. Jason praised her constantly, too constantly. Brianna really understands branding. Brianna has incredible instincts with media. Brianna just gets me. That last one stuck with me. I noticed how he'd lower his voice when her name came up, how he'd tilt his phone away from me when messages came in late at night, how he'd suddenly protect his calendar like it contained state secrets. When I asked, carefully, calmly, he sighed. "Why are you interrogating me?" "She's an employee, Emily. You're being paranoid." Paranoid. That word landed harder than he realized. His friends started treating me differently too. Conversations stopped when I approached. Smiles tightened. Invitations became indirect, filtered through Jason instead of coming to me directly. Miranda Blackwell was the worst. She had a way of observing without blinking, filing things away. At charity galas, she'd lean close and say things like, "It must be nice not having to worry about appearances." Jason really thrives when he's supported properly. I didn't know what she meant. Or maybe I did and refused to admit it. Even Jason's family grew bolder. His mother once commented over dinner, "Well, Jason really is the company now, isn't he?" I waited for him to correct her. He didn't. That night, lying beside him in our penthouse, I stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar tightening in my chest. Not anger, not fear, doubt. The kind that whispers, "Are you still essential or just useful?" I tried to ground myself in facts. I owned the patents. I owned the shares. I owned the infrastructure. Paper didn't lie. But relationships didn't run on spreadsheets. Jason started coming home later. When he did, he was distracted, half listening, already mentally elsewhere. He'd scroll through his phone while I spoke, nodding without absorbing a word. Once, I reached for his hand. He pulled away without thinking. "I'm exhausted," he said. "Can we not do this right now?" "Do what? Be married?" The air between us grew heavier each day, thick with things unsaid. And still, I told myself this was normal. Stress, success, growth pains. I convinced myself that trust meant silence, that loyalty meant patience, that love meant not asking too many questions. So when his birthday approached, I didn't hesitate. I booked the Meridian Grand Ballroom. I approved every invoice. I paid without flinching. Because part of me still believed that showing up, financially, emotionally, would bring us back to balance. I didn't know I was funding my own erasure. I didn't know the seed had already grown roots. And by the time I sensed the ground shifting beneath me, it was far too late to stop the fall. The investor meeting should have been routine. Exhausting, yes, but routine. The Tokyo partners were meticulous, analytical, relentless with their questions. They dissected projections, probed risk exposure, challenged assumptions buried deep in the architecture of our models. This wasn't something I could delegate, not tonight. Not with $75 million and the future of quantum dynamics on the line. Still, my eyes kept drifting to my watch. 8:42 p.m., 8:57 p.m., 9:13 p.m. Jason's birthday celebration had started at 8. I imagined him under the chandeliers, laughing, accepting compliments, basking in attention. I told myself I'd arrive late, but memorable. I pictured his expression when I handed him the Cartier necklace, how the room would pause, how forgiveness would come easily. At 9:58 p.m., the meeting finally adjourned. I barely heard the closing pleasantries. I was already standing, already reaching for my coat, already calling the driver. My heart beat faster, not with guilt, but urgency, like I was racing towards something that still mattered. The city lights blurred past as I sat in the back of the car, fingers wrapped tightly around the small black box. I rehearsed my apology. Calm, warm, reasonable. I had to finish the meeting. This was important for us. I'm here now. When the car pulled up to the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 10:20 p.m., confusion hit first. Guests were leaving, not drifting out slowly, but pouring onto the sidewalk, flushed and animated, laughing like they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. I checked my phone again. No messages, no calls, no missed notifications. My chest tightened. Jason's parties didn't end early, ever. As I stepped onto the pavement, heels clicking against stone, a strange hush settled over me, like the moment before impact. That's when I saw Miranda. She walked past me deliberately, slowing just enough to make sure I noticed the way her eyes flicked to my hand. The box, the absence. "Well," she said, stopping fully now, voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Better late than never, I suppose." Her friends laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, knowingly. Something cold slid down my spine. I didn't respond. I pushed past her and into the building, the revolving doors whispering closed behind me like a verdict. The lobby was breathtaking. Marble pillars, crystal chandeliers, everything I'd paid for, perfectly staged. And there he was. Jason stood near the center of the space, relaxed, radiant, his body angled toward Brianna in a way that felt intimate even before I saw their hands, intertwined, fingers woven together like they belonged there. Time slowed. I noticed details I never would have registered otherwise. The way her thumb brushed the inside of his wrist, the way he leaned in slightly when she laughed, the familiarity, the ease. When Jason saw me, his expression didn't change. No shock, no guilt, no embarrassment. Just satisfaction. "Oh," he said lightly, his voice carrying across the marble floor. You came. I stopped a few feet away, my body suddenly heavy, uncooperative. I thought you got my message, he continued. You weren't invited tonight. The words didn't register all at once. They arrived piece by piece, like shrapnel. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling as I scrolled through our messages. Nothing. No text. No explanation. Just yesterday's reminder about his dry cleaning. Brianna stepped closer to him. Closer than necessary. This was for Jason's real supporters, she said smoothly. People who actually show up. Real supporters. People I had introduced, networked, funded, enabled. Jason didn't correct her. He adjusted his posture instead, subtly, possessively, and added, "Thanks for covering everything, though. The venue was stunning, and the champagne, perfect." I looked down at the box in my hand, then back at them. In that moment, understanding hit me with brutal clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional chaos. It was planned. I had financed my own public humiliation, paid for the lights, the music, the witnesses, while my husband replaced me without flinching. They walked past me together, brushing my shoulder as if I were furniture. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I turned around and walked out because something inside me had already begun calculating consequences. And once that part of me woke up, there was no going back. I don't remember the drive home, not the traffic lights, not the turns, not the sound of the city. My body operated on instinct, muscle memory guiding me through streets I'd driven 1,000 times, while my mind replayed the same scene over and over. Jason's hand in hers, his voice, the casual cruelty of, "You weren't invited." I didn't cry. That surprised me. I expected tears, hysteria, something loud and obvious. Instead, there was a hollow calm, like the moment after a loud explosion when your ears ring and the world feels far away. When I stepped into our penthouse just after midnight, the silence felt accusatory. The space was immaculate, expensive, cold. It looked less like a home and more like a museum, curated to display success that no longer belonged to both of us. I kicked off my heels and stood there, barefoot on marble, breathing slowly. In, out. In, out. Think, I told myself. Don't collapse. I went straight to my home office, not because I planned anything dramatic, at least not consciously, but because it was the only place where I felt grounded, where facts lived, where emotions didn't get to rewrite reality. I unlocked the biometric drawer in my desk and pulled out the black leather portfolio I updated every quarter. Corporate structure, patents, share distribution, financial transfers, years of documentation I'd maintained out of habit, not suspicion. I spread everything across the desk, and that's when the weight of it all finally settled. Every transfer to Jason's accounts, every luxury expense, every flight, every hotel, every invoice I'd approved without question because I believed we were a team. I sat back in my chair and stared at the numbers, not as a betrayed wife, as a founder, as a majority shareholder, as a woman who had confused generosity with loyalty and silence with strength. For the first time that night, my hands shook. How long? How long had I been disappearing? I replayed conversations in my head, moments I'd brushed aside, his dismissive tone, his impatience when I asked questions, the way he'd framed my concerns as insecurity instead of insight. I hadn't been blind. I'd been choosing peace over truth. And now, peace was gone. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, not to numb anything, but to slow my thoughts. I needed clarity, not comfort. The burn grounded me, anchored me back into my body. I thought about confronting him, calling him, demanding explanations. And then I realized something unsettling. Jason didn't think he'd done anything wrong. You don't humiliate someone publicly unless you're convinced they no longer matter. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. I walked to the windows and looked out over the city. Thousands of lights, millions of lives, each one moving forward while mine felt paused, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. What did I miss? I asked myself. The answer came quietly. I had mistaken being indispensable for being respected. I had allowed my silence to be rewritten as absence. I had built an empire and then stepped aside while someone else claimed the throne. The shock faded. The pain settled. And beneath it all, something sharper emerged. Focus. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop. Not to react, not to lash out, but to understand exactly what leverage still belonged to me. Because if Jason thought tonight was the end of me, he had profoundly misunderstood who he was married to. By the time the city began to quiet, my calm had hardened into something deliberate. I wasn't acting out of rage. Rage is messy, predictable, easy to dismiss. What I felt was colder and far more dangerous. I logged into the corporate banking system with the familiarity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Multi-factor authentication, biometric verification, administrative access granted. This was my world, my architecture, my safeguards. The primary operational account sat there, unchanged. $186 million, representing years of work, sleepless nights, and battles won quietly behind closed doors. Money meant to protect the company, not to bankroll betrayal. I took a breath, and then I moved. First, I canceled Jason's upcoming trip. Bora Bora, 2 weeks, private resort, booked under Jason Anderson and Brianna Stone. Romantic getaway, celebration retreat. Total cost just shy of $150,000. I clicked cancel. The system warned me about penalties and forfeited deposits. I confirmed without hesitation. Some lessons are expensive by necessity. Next came the vendors from tonight's party. Catering, floral design, venue management, entertainment, security. I halted payment authorizations one by one. Each confirmation felt less like revenge and more like reclaiming oxygen. Finally, I navigated to the advanced controls, areas most executives never touched because they didn't understand them. I froze the accounts, all of them. Operational, payroll, development, discretionary. Everything except the emergency reserve I alone controlled. Within seconds, automated alerts fired across the system. Emails, texts, internal warnings, payment failures. Jason's phone would be lighting up right about now. I leaned back in my chair as the city blinked beneath me. The phone buzzed once, twice, then relentlessly. Jason, Brianna, our CFO, board members I barely spoke to anymore. I didn't answer. I poured another drink, slower this time, and allowed myself a moment to breathe. Not relief, not triumph, resolve. By morning, the consequences were unavoidable. 63 missed calls. 21 from Jason. 14 from Brianna. 18 from our CFO, whose job description suddenly felt very real to him. I made coffee, took a shower, read the market updates like it was any other day. When you've built systems, you trust them to hold while emotions rage outside. At 11:30 a.m., the doorman called. "There's a young woman in the lobby," he said carefully. "She says she works for Mr. Anderson and claims it's an emergency." 5 minutes later, pounding rattled my door. When I opened it, Rebecca, Jason's assistant, stood there pale and frantic, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "The company is in chaos," she blurted. "Payroll is frozen, accounts are inaccessible. Jason told the board it was a temporary glitch, but..." I stepped aside and let her in. "Sounds like a management problem," I said calmly. She stared at me, stunned. "Emily, Jason said you'd calm down, that you'd fix this." I met her gaze steadily. "Were you at the party last night?" She hesitated, nodded. "And did you notice that I wasn't?" Her face drained. Understanding settled heavily between us. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh my God." "Yes," I said softly. now you understand." Rebecca left an hour later, shaken and silent. And for the first time since last night, I allowed myself to sit still. Jason had taken my silence for weakness. The board had mistaken distance for disengagement. And now the entire structure they relied on was frozen, because the person they erased had never actually left. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of consequences. That night, after Rebecca left and the apartment fell silent again, the weight finally found me. Not as panic, not as regret, as exhaustion. I sat alone on the edge of the bed we once shared, still neatly made, still smelling faintly of the cologne Jason wore so carefully, like every detail of his life needed to be curated for an audience. The city outside pulsed with energy, but inside, everything felt hollow. For the first time since the lobby, my chest ached. I wasn't grieving the marriage I'd lost. I was grieving the years I'd given away quietly. Years where I shrank myself so someone else could shine. Years where I told myself this is what partnership looks like, while slowly erasing my own presence. I picked up my phone. There were voicemails I hadn't listened to, texts I hadn't read. I opened one from Jason, sent at 2:14 a.m. "Emily, this has gone too far. You're embarrassing me. Call me now." Not "I'm sorry." Not "let's talk." "You're embarrassing me." I stared at the screen until it went dark. Another message came in moments later. "Brianna didn't mean anything by it. You're overreacting." That was when something inside me finally broke. Not shattered, collapsed inward. I realized I had been explaining myself for years to someone who never intended to understand. I had been negotiating my worth with a man who measured value in optics. I lay back and closed my eyes. For a moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far, if freezing everything had crossed some invisible line, if I'd become the villain in a story I hadn't chosen. That doubt was the most dangerous part, because it tempted me to retreat, to apologize, to restore order at my own expense, again. Tears came then, quiet ones, the kind that slip out when no one is watching and pride finally loosens its grip. I let them fall without wiping them away, not for Jason, for myself. For the woman who once believed building something extraordinary would make her unreplaceable. I thought about the younger version of me, sleeves pushed up, eyes burning with focus, writing code until sunrise because she loved the challenge. She hadn't dreamed of luxury or recognition. She dreamed of creation. Somewhere along the way, I had let love distract me from self-respect. The realization hurt more than betrayal ever could. I sat up slowly and took a deep breath. This was the bottom. Not the humiliation, not the public exclusion. This quiet understanding that I could no longer return to who I was before. And strangely, once I accepted that, the pain softened. Because if there was no going back, then the only direction left was forward. The turning point didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with clarity. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen counter as if nothing in my world had shifted. I stood there with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, rereading the same email Rebecca had sent overnight. Short, careful, and quietly devastating. She hadn't meant it as evidence. She hadn't meant it as betrayal. She meant it as honesty. Attached were calendar entries, expense approvals, internal memos, things she thought I already knew. Jason and Brianna's branding retreats, private flights labeled executive strategy, hotel stays approved as investor engagement. Patterns I'd ignored now laid out cleanly, unemotional, undeniable. This wasn't an affair born of chaos. It was operational, calculated, financed with company funds I controlled, but no longer supervised closely. I didn't feel rage when I finished reading. I felt something steadier, ownership. Rebecca arrived mid-morning, quieter than the day before. She sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes downcast. "I didn't know how to say this without making it worse," she said softly. "But you deserve to see the full picture." "I know," I replied, "and I meant it." She hesitated. "Jason believes you'll reverse everything once the board pressures you." I smiled, Not bitterly, not sarcastically. He still doesn't understand, I said. And that's okay. Because this wasn't about punishing him. It was about ending a lie. After Rebecca left, I opened a new document. Not an emotional letter. Not an accusation. A restructuring agreement. Every clause aligned with existing authority. Every demand supported by documentation. No theatrics. No vengeance. Just consequences. Jason would step down as CEO, effective immediately. Brianna would be terminated. No severance. All financial authority would return to my oversight. Public acknowledgement of my foundational role would be issued without spin or omission. I wasn't taking anything that wasn't already mine. I was reclaiming what I had allowed others to borrow. That evening, Jason showed up at my door. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he wore so easily the night before had cracked. I didn't think you'd actually do this, he said quietly. Do what? I asked. Act like the person who built the company? He tried to bargain, apologize, minimize. He promised to end things, to fix it, to make statements. But none of it addressed the truth. I trusted you, I said evenly. And you used that trust as camouflage. He went silent. When he finally signed the agreement hours later, his hand shook. Not because he was losing everything, because for the first time, he was facing a reality he couldn't charm his way out of. As the door closed behind him, I stood alone in my apartment and felt something settle into place. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And for the first time in years, my life belonged to me again. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unraveled, quietly, publicly, and without mercy. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the boardroom at Quantum Dynamics felt like a pressure chamber. Glass walls, city skyline, a long mahogany table polished to a reflective sheen. Every seat was filled. No one spoke above a whisper. Jason sat at the far end. He looked diminished. His posture was stiff, his confidence stripped down to something brittle. Brianna wasn't there. She already knew. People always know before they're officially told. I took my seat at the head of the table, the place that had always been mine on paper, even when I rarely occupied it. Good morning, I said calmly. I assume you're all aware why we're here. No one answered. I opened my leather portfolio and slid copies of the signed agreement across the table. Effective immediately, I continued, Jason Anderson is stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of Quantum Dynamics. A collective inhale swept the room. Jason didn't look up. Additionally, I said, meeting each board member's eyes in turn, Brianna Stone's employment has been terminated. No severance, no transition. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." This company was built on my algorithms, my patents, and my capital, I went on, my voice steady. There has been confusion about that. Today, that confusion ends. No one argued. Because no one could. Jason stood slowly, like gravity had increased around him. I'll cooperate fully, he said, voice low. This was my failure. It was the first honest thing he'd said in weeks. By noon, security escorted Brianna out of the building with a cardboard box under her arm. Employees watched through glass walls, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. Reputation doesn't shatter, it erodes. By evening, Jason's phone stopped ringing. Friends went quiet. Invitations vanished. Support evaporated. The public statement went live 2 weeks later. Precise, factual, unembellished. It acknowledged my foundational role, corrected the record, and closed the chapter without drama. The media response was swift. Think pieces, industry debates, commentary about invisible founders and performative leadership. Jason's name became a footnote, a cautionary example. I watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction, with closure. I moved out of the penthouse shortly after. Smaller apartment, sunlit, quiet, no staff, no pretense, just space. The divorce finalized months later. Clean, restrained, inevitable. Jason relocated. He sent one letter. I didn't reply. I didn't need the last word. Because the truth had already said everything. I don't tell this story because I won. I tell it because I survived becoming invisible and choosing not to stay that way. Months after everything settled, my life became quieter in ways I hadn't realized I needed. I moved into a smaller apartment overlooking Central Park, one with sunlight instead of mirrors. I sold the excess. I canceled the things I'd once paid for to keep someone else comfortable. I kept only what felt honest. Quantum dynamics stabilized quickly under my leadership. Investors didn't flee. They leaned in. Clarity has a way of restoring confidence. I took on fewer public appearances, not because I feared them, but because I no longer needed validation from rooms full of strangers. I started mentoring young founders again. Women who reminded me of who I'd been before I learned to minimize myself. People who loved the work more than the applause. I taught graduate seminars. I invested carefully, intentionally. Jason faded from my daily thoughts faster than I expected. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it no longer defined me. I used to believe love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant silence, that being strong meant carrying everything alone. I was wrong. Love without respect is erosion. Silence without safety is disappearance. Strength isn't endurance, it's boundaries. The hardest lesson wasn't learning that someone I trusted could betray me. It was learning that I had allowed myself to be slowly erased because I thought it made me generous. If you're watching this and you feel like you're shrinking to keep someone else comfortable, pay attention. If your work is being credited to others, your voice dismissed, your presence treated as optional, listen to that discomfort. It's not insecurity, it's instinct. Walking away didn't make me weaker. Reclaiming my place didn't make me cruel. Refusing to finance my own disappearance didn't make me petty. It made me whole again. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't revenge. It's remembering who you were before anyone convinced you that you were replaceable. And choosing, deliberately, never to forget that again.